Good morning. My name is Catherine. I use she, her pronouns, and I am both delighted and terrified to take us on a whistle-stop tour through the book of Daniel and his eponymous lion's den. Welcome to Daniel. This week is our only brush with Daniel, so it is worth spending a little bit of time locating ourselves. In the Christian Bible, Daniel is associated with the prophets. The first half of the book is narrative, the second half is prophecy. Unfortunately for us, the consensus is that the stories in Daniel are folktales and that Daniel never existed. Daniel is also noteworthy for being a bilingual book. It is written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. The way that Daniel is divided by language highlights three distinct sections in the book. The introduction in Hebrew provides the historical setting. The middle section in Aramaic details the classic court stories like we hear today and includes the first of Daniel's visions. And the final section, written in Hebrew, contains more of Daniel's visions, which are more detailed prophecies. The two languages in the book mirror the clash of cultures that the Jews experienced when they were exiled from their land. They were forced to adopt the new language of Aramaic, but their hopes for deliverance are seen in the continuation of Hebrew. The first time we meet Daniel is when he is a teenager, taken captive to Babylon. We meet him again a few years later in chapter 2, where he, as a young man, is called to interpret a dream for King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel shows up again in chapter 4 as a middle-aged man who is once again asked to interpret a dream for the troubled king. Now, in chapter 6, Daniel returns to view. Here he is an old man in his 80s who has been in Babylon for 70 years. If today's reading feels a bit like a rerun, that's because the story of Daniel echoes two other stories we've heard throughout this series this year, Joseph and Esther. In the story of Daniel and the lion's den, we are revisiting the court tale. The court tale does what it says on the tin. It's a story which takes place in a royal court and often involves intrigue or clever action. During this year's preaching series, we have heard lots of court tales, but I want to turn your minds to the stories of Joseph, Esther, and now Daniel. All three of these stories tell of an extraordinary Jewish person who rises to prominence under a foreign king and triumphs over the forces of evil. Like Joseph, who rose to prominence as second in command after Pharaoh, and Mordecai in the book of Esther, who rose to the same position in the Persian court, Daniel rises to the similarly prestigious position in the Babylonian court. Both Joseph and Daniel are taken into captivity and become courtiers of foreign kings. Joseph and Daniel both rise to prominence because of their God-given ability to interpret dreams, and both achieve high office in the service of a foreign king. In both Daniel and Esther, we see the titular character threatened with mortal danger while living in the court of a foreign king. Both Esther and Daniel have their lives threatened for their faith. Why have three stories that are so similar and say almost the exact same thing? Some suggest that all three stories, Joseph, Esther, and Daniel, were written as guides for the Jews on how to live in diaspora that demonstrates that it is possible to fully participate in the life of a foreign nation. As I sat down to start writing this sermon, I was struck that every single commentary I had basically the same interpretation. Everything I looked at said that Daniel is a model for faithfulness and that the story is a story about how trusting in God will protect us. And, try as I might, I just couldn't bring myself to write that sermon. Don't get me wrong, those are good and faithful interpretations of the story of Daniel written by far greater theological minds than mine. And yet, as I tried to find a way into Daniel's faithfulness in the face of death, I found myself feeling like a fraud. Who am I to teach anyone about fearless faith when I am a big old scaredy cat? So I put the commentaries back on the shelf. I closed all my browser tabs and tried to work out why I felt like a liar trying to write about Daniel's faithfulness. The truth of the matter is that I am the anti-Daniel. When we hear the story of Daniel, we want to imagine ourselves as Daniel, the hero of the faith, standing firm against the forces of empire. But the reality is, when I'm really honest about who I am, I know that I'm not Daniel. Could I stare down Donald Trump, Gina Reinhart, or Elon Musk, refuse to deny my faith and accept certain death? No way! I would fold like a cheap suit. I get uncomfortable explaining my tattoos and often explain my Sunday morning plans as catching up with friends, as though Jesus and I are headed for brunch. I want to be like Daniel. I strive to be the model of faithfulness like Daniel, yet I often fall so far short. So, if I'm not Daniel, could I be King Darius? Darius isn't all bad. On one hand, he planned to set Daniel over the whole kingdom, and he is clearly very worried about Daniel's well-being, so worried that he doesn't eat or drink while Daniel is in the lion's den. On the other hand, he goes along with the plan of the satraps and condemns Daniel to a certain and horrible death. And then he follows it up by commanding that all the men who had condemned Daniel, along with their wives and children, hundreds of people, be thrown in the lion's den, where the lions overpowered them and crushed their bones. Hardly a model of leadership. Maybe on a good day I'm King Darius, well-intentioned but passive, ineffectual and too often ruled by ego. As I read today's passage over and over and over again, trying to work out what to say, I came to the very uncomfortable realization that most of the time I'm the satraps, and at my worst, I am the lion's den. Darius appointed 120 men to rule over his kingdom. These men helped ensure that Darius and his kingdom were protected from theft, tax evasion, and military revolts, each ruling over a specific province of the kingdom. Being a satrap is a good gig. You have power and influence and money. Over these 120 men were 3 men who acted as vice-regents, and over all those were Daniel, who answered directly to the king. This must have been infuriating to the satraps. How dare an old Jewish slave find such favor with the king and be promoted to sit over them? Seething with jealousy, the satraps decided that they must destroy Daniel. Now, I've never tried to have someone thrown into a pit of lions, but I have certainly whiled away some hours imagining the downfall of my various nemesis. I have relegated my fair share of people to the lion's den in my mind. The satraps are viciously jealous of Daniel, a deeply human experience. So what is jealousy? Jealousy, put simply, is a kind of fear. The fear that someone is going to take what you have. The satraps were scared that Daniel was going to take what they had for himself. I am scared that my colleague at work is going to take the credit for that project I've been working on. We live in a very scared society where that fear and jealousy get supercharged and turned into hate. Cue the lion pits. The lion pit looks different these days, perhaps more like a detention centre on Nauru, or a supermax prison in Goulburn, or a neo-Nazi rally outside Parliament House. But the effect is much the same. Our fear gets turned into violence and rips people limb from limb. So what do we do with all this fear? We aren't told much about Daniel's response to being sent to the lion's pit, except in verse 23, where we are told that he trusted in God. But that doesn't mean that Daniel was never scared. The last half of the book of Daniel is spent on several visions he received, starting in the reign of Belshazzar. In chapter 7, the writer says, "As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart." Now that's relatable. I know what it feels like when my spirit within me is anxious and my thoughts greatly alarm me. It's actually a pretty accurate summary of how I feel right now. I think fear wants to keep us still, to never do anything new, to stay home, never go anywhere new, never meet anyone new. Fear tells us that keeping everything the same will keep us safe. Fear is conservative. American theologian Harry Emerson Fosdick said, "Fear imprisons, faith liberates. Fear paralyzes, faith empowers. Fear disheartens, faith encourages. Fear sickens, faith heals. Fear makes useless, faith makes serviceable." So my best guess is that the antidote to fear is love. In 2 Timothy, the writer says, "For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline." But not just the generic, soft-focused, fuzzy, well-intentioned, but passive love of King Darius, but the actual, radical, liberating love of God modeled by Jesus in the Gospels. When we love like Dorothy Day, who said, "I really only love God as much as the person I love the least," that is how we can build a faith that triumphs over fear. When we live as in Micah 6, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Then we can build a faith that triumphs over fear. When we really live the words of the benediction we say every week, keep faith, do justice, and build community until the glory of the kingdom come, then we can build a faith that will triumph over fear. And as we build that faith, we have to feel the fear and do it anyway, acting with love while terrified, all the while remembering Daniel, who was both faithful and afraid. For there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. Let us always be striving to be made perfect in love. Amen.